Are we live yet?
We haven't formally called the meeting to start, although I do see 7 o'clock. I was just waiting for more of council if possible. I don't actually have regrets from anyone, I don't think. Do we have regrets? I don't know who's here from clerks tonight. Saw Genevieve in the building.
You have quorum, your worship.
Okay.
We have 4 people in the.
I don't know that I have a clerk.
Sorry, thank you, Merlo. I'm in the room here.
Right.
Councillor Back has sent his regrets, so he's not attending this evening.
Okay. Great. All right. Well, I will call this meeting to order for the council workshop for November 25th at 7 o'clock. Council, we have an agenda that's been circulated. Any errors or omissions from the agenda is presented? Hearing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Contrary minded? Motion is carried. We have no minutes that have been circulated with the package, and so we're just here to deal with the one item that's been referred to this workshop. I will just say, just before I hand it off to Mr. Milburn, I remember when we had the discussion about this item as a regular meeting agenda, and then it was referred to a workshop. In the prep on that day, Mr. Milburn and I had a conversation about how we should handle Dapper, because it is a fairly complex issue. And so we were a little nervous about it being wordsmithed during the middle of the council meeting. And so when I heard that there was some desire by council to get into the details and possibly make some changes, I did make the recommendation that this be referred to a workshop as well. And I believe Councillor Murray also indicated that. So we did refer to the workshop here. And so but it's basically the same content that we had last time. But I'm still going to go to staff for additional comments because there were a number of questions that were asked by council at the time. And so maybe if you could do a bit of a recap and get us going tonight, we'd appreciate that. So over to you, Mr. Milburn.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mayor Little, members of council, and members of the viewing public. We're happy to be back tonight following from a November 3rd council date when council gave first reading to a couple bylaws that staff have indicated would help us improve some efficiencies through some delegated authorities and so on. Some of the details we'll be, of course, walking through that tonight and happy to answer any questions from council. The one thing I would just remind council is that what was presented on November 3rd and what's being discussed tonight, this is not the sum totality of all the DAPR initiatives that are ongoing. I would just remind council the ongoing zoning bylaw review, council's update to the amenity cost charge bylaw, and many, many other bylaws, large bylaw efforts are also designed to improve efficiency, make things easier for owners of land, for businesses to apply and receive permits and approvals from the district. What we have tonight is Mr. Graham Budge and Lisa Stallum are going to be presenting a presentation, and they've tried to segment it into the topical areas and then provide an opportunity for council to ask questions and for staff to respond after each of those sections. So we're trying to go through each of the bylaw recommendations that are before you tonight. And with your worship's permission, I'd like to hand it off to Graham to lead council through the presentation.
Can I just pause this for just a sec? I just want to check in with the clerks. I understand that Councillor Pope is trying to join the meeting and having some challenges. Can we just confirm that there's some IT support for Councillor Pope?
Thank you, Your Worship. That's correct. We do have IT support. I've just sent the link to her again, but we'll get her to touch base with IT to assist.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, back to staff.
All right, Mr. Budge. Looks like he's queuing up the presentation.
All right. So long as you can hear me, thank you,
Thank you, Your Worship, and members of council. Sorry, just tidying up my screen here. So good evening to everyone. Again, my name is Graham Budge, Development Planner and DAPR Program Coordinator, and I'm here as well with my manager, Lisa Stallam, Section Manager of Administration and Continuous Improvement. So at the November 3rd regular meeting, as Mr. Milburn mentioned, Council gave first reading to bylaws 8763 and 8764 and referred those bylaws to a workshop, which is why we're here. Before diving into further explanation and examples of those proposed bylaw amendments, I want to contextualize tonight's subject matter within the DAPR program as a whole. So the district's DAPR program was conceived in 2023, and the implementation phase began in 2025. The implementation plan, it as a whole involves process reviews within each staff sector that deals with development approvals, as well as, or rather, as we all know, there's other major land use regulation changes that have been occurring parallel to the DAPR program. And by that, I mean, the OCP update and the zoning bylaw rewrite. But these proposed bylaws that we're here talking about tonight are just the first tranche of proposed housekeeping and procedural improvements from, more specifically, the development planning sector associated with the DAPR program. So more opportunities for improvement will come to council over time from other staff sectors as the program continues. So remembering that staff sectors will periodically bringing forward bylaw amendments for housekeeping and regulatory streamlining, I'm going to dive into the main subject tonight, which I mentioned earlier was the proposed amendments that we introduced on November 3rd and that were given first reading. So as mentioned, and given my connection to the development planning team, as you all know me as a development planner as well as the DAPR program coordinator, I'm the one to bring forward these bylaw amendments to the development procedures bylaw and to the official community plan that propose regulatory and administrative streamlining within the development planning team's scope of work. So these bylaws that we are proposing, these amendment bylaws, relate to improvements to 4 categories within the development planning team's scope of work. So as Dan mentioned, I have the presentation into 4 sections to just segment them for more simple understanding. So the first part of the presentation will be improvements to the public hearing procedure, and that's under the development procedures bylaw amendment. The second part will be about delegating a type of development permits to staff, and that's nested under the OCP amendments. Thirdly, there will be a batch of general administrative improvements associated with development permits, also in the official community plan amendment section. And the fourth part of the presentation will be about variance permit delegation, and that's again back on the left under the development procedures bylaw amendment. So on to the first part of the presentation, which, as I mentioned, is the development procedures bylaw amendment that would improve the public hearing procedure. So council, I'm certain that this has been discussed before, and I think we just will benefit from starting with a categorization. There's 3 types of zoning bylaw approvals that direct the public hearing process. So, first, those where a public hearing is required, and that relates to whenever there's an OCP amendment. Now, there's also those that involve a public hearing being prohibited, and that's when there's consistency with an OCP and when the zoning bylaw proposes a majority residential use. And there's a third category, those where a public hearing is optional, relating to OCP compliant zoning bylaws that do not relate to residential development, that are not majority residential development. So tonight, when I talk about this improved public hearing procedure, I'm talking exclusively about this third category, where the public hearing is optional. So the current optional public hearing procedure is shown in the top graphic on screen here. Staff have to ask council whether or not to hold a public hearing, and shown in that little red that red indicator there is where we make that recommendation and hear council's resolution on the matter. So, having to come to council for that decision, it adds time and associated costs to the bylaw approval process. And we've heard from council, we've heard from public, we've heard from industry that this is seen as unnecessary red tape. So moving on to the below animation, it represents the improved bylaw approval process that we're proposing, where staff would follow operational guidelines to proactively notify that the public hearing will not be held when the guidelines are met. So I just want to stress that despite that that proactive notification when the guidelines are met, we can see that there is a shifting of process further earlier in the timeline. But despite that, council would still have the ability to choose whether or not to hold the public hearing. So this doesn't impact council's ability to decide whether or not to hold a public hearing. It's just a procedural improvement that opens up an efficient processing streamline should guidelines be met. So I want to call back to a comment that was made on November 3rd. There was some confusion about whether or what benefit this new procedure would have. And I just want to clarify that the proactive notification, as we can see here, would have explicit time savings of about a month at a minimum, and that there's also implicit cost savings associated with not hosting an agenda, not posting an agenda item with such a limited purpose of seeking that decision to hold or not hold a public hearing. So council at the November 3rd meeting asked for examples of when this procedure might occur. And so I show the guidelines of when staff will recommend and proactively notify that a public hearing not be held. And as shown on the left side of the screen here, this includes, above all else, consistency with the OCP. And then, as I mentioned, staff will still recommend that a public hearing be held when a proposed rezoning involves RS zone lots, a significant impact to the community or the environment, or if it generates significant public feedback. And despite staff's recommendation, council has the ability to resolve to hold the public hearing where it is optional or required. Of course, it would be required. So I want to call back again to a question that was brought forward on November 3rd. There was a question about whether staff might have to re-notify of a public hearing should council resolve against staff's recommendation. So if we had proactively notified that a public hearing would not be held because it met the guidelines, but if at the time of introduction, council resolved to hold a public hearing, what would happen then? So it's basically, it would fall back to the standard or right now the existing procedure where at the time of introduction, council could give a reading to the bylaw, and then a public hearing would be held subsequent to council's direction to hold the public hearing. And yes, there would be some sunk cost associated with notifying incorrectly, but I think that we can all agree that should the guidelines be agreed upon and followed, that re-notification is unlikely to occur at the same benefit that would be experienced when staff accurately recommend and council agree with staff's recommendation to not hold. So the benefits outweigh the costs in this case. So that concludes part one about the improved public hearing procedure, which would save, in summary, would save about 1 month of time and associated meeting costs, and not impact council's ability to resolve to hold a public hearing. So I just wanted to summarize that before we move into a discussion or any questions about this topic before moving into part two.
Okay, so just to be clear, so whether we waive it or not, this new procedure will save time.
That's correct.
Thank you. Councillor Mary, your comments, please.
And we're doing this because the province is telling us to do it, right? No, so we're doing this on our own. So where is the part about the province telling us that we're not allowed to hold public hearings anymore if there's a development application in the OCP that they're meeting?
Yeah, so through the mayor to Councillor Mary, again, we at the start of the presentation, I noted at the start of this category, I noted 3 zoning bylaw approval categories, and there are those where it's prohibited. We're not talking about those where it's prohibited. We're not talking about those where it's required. We're talking about the third category where it's optional, and this is a efficiency option should guidelines be met to just offer that streamlining where optional.
Okay, so consistent with the OCP. Okay, but the OCP is or isn't a living document anymore. Okay. If staff support it, then we're not going to hold a public hearing.
Sorry.
Supportive public input. Like who determines?
Councillor, just to be clear, just because staff support it doesn't mean council still can't choose to hold a public hearing on the optionals.
I understand. I'm just questioning some of the rationale behind why we would not hold it or hold it. So it says supportive public input, and I saw that in the report that was presented at the last meeting. Who determines what is supportive public input? Do we do that? Does staff do that? I remember in the report it said if you know the information is coming from the public that they generally support, but how do we gather input from the public? Right now it's, even last night people said they didn't even know about the traffic discussion in the workshop last night. So how we rely on signs with, sometimes the information is vague. Even the amendments to the OCP, it was housekeeping and OCP amendments. I mean, most people would never even understand what that means. So the information that we're putting out into the public is a direct result of the kind of input that we'll bring back. And I'm just wondering, is council going to be seeing supportive public input? And isn't that the whole point of a public hearing?
I've got a response from Mr. Milburn.
Thanks very much, Your Worship. Just to respond to that question, so we're not recommending at this point any change to the existing engagement that occurs in advance of the staff report being written. So with your typical rezoning application, there's council's familiar with project information meetings. We send information reports to council in advance of those meetings, advising council of those meetings occurring. We invite input, and then we summarize that input in the staff report to council. All of that would be the same. So council would become aware of the engagement that we're doing at the stage of review, where we're reviewing and formulating a recommendation. Council would then receive a summary of the information about what we hear from the public, and that would be in the staff report. And Councillor Meary asked the question, who would decide about the extent of the public input and whether or not staff's recommendation would be to hold a public hearing. And that would be a discretion of staff. We would essentially be providing advice. We would say whether or not we had heard, enough input from the community that was raising concerns where we felt this should be a matter that council would then decide early in the process, as early as possible, when to hold a public hearing or not.
So just on that, I would have a real, so staff is going to be determining what they think is important for council to consider in regards to public input.
Just as we do now, we summarize the input we received from the public and share that with council in a report. And what we're suggesting is that in circumstances where there was, significant community concern, staff wouldn't be recommending to waive the public hearing, and instead would bring that forward to council for consideration on whether or not to hold a public hearing, because it's still optional.
I guess my point, though, Mr. Milburn, is that generally after that process is completed with staff summarizing public input, we do go to a public hearing. So council does get to hear for a second time. And then there would be a debate to ensue whether we go forward or not. So then,
which would still occur at first reading. That debate could still occur at first reading, and council, having seen the feedback received up to that point, could choose to then have that optional public hearing, is what we're suggesting.
Yeah, I as you know, I'm a bit cynical about the kind of community outreach and the communication with the community already. I have been for a number of years. I think we rely a lot on our website and social media in hopes that people understand what's going on, and I just don't think they do. But we continue to, go in that direction. So, I just don't think most people understand what's going on in regards to a lot of these applications. So on the next one would be employment industrial lands. So you don't want to hold a public hearing on employment industrial lands?
Through the mayor to Councillor Murray, I would encourage you to give me a moment to get to the second part of my presentation, where we'll talk about the industrial subject matter of this. And with respect to public hearings, with respect to industrial lands, we're not talking about rezonings. We're just talking about development permits. So we'll get to that in the next section.
Environment and climate.
Your worship, can I just ask Graham to back up the slides? So back up the slide to the criteria slide. Just a couple of slides back. I think Councillor Murray is referring to those items in your list.
Yeah.
And so that's what she's asking about. The presentation.
We'll have the
this one here. That's correct.
Hold a public hearing. So employment and industrial lands, under what circumstance would we not hold a public hearing for employment and industrial lands?
So yeah, thanks for the clarification. And then basically this is a suite of guidelines. So it's not meant to be exclusively one, but the employment and industrial lands relates to economic development, job creation, things that are in alignment with the economic development strategy, the district economic development strategy. So if it's generating employment or relates to regionally important industrial lands, it's possible that further to the other guidelines here, in combination with all the guidelines, staff would make a recommendation to not hold a public hearing.
Mayor Little, just if I can for context, just to remind council here, the recommended guideline does not affect council's discretion either way. This is simply some guidance to staff as to when we should be recommending that council hold a public hearing and in circumstances where one may not be necessary. And in the case of employment industrial lands, council up to this point has typically waived the need for public hearings in those circumstances. So we were taking our cues from council's past decisions. and inserting that as a guide. The other comment in terms of environment and climate is, if there was an issue that would negatively impact the climate, the environment in some way, staff would be recommending that council consider a public hearing in those circumstances. So that's why it's simply noted in this criteria. It's not a limitation on council anyway. It's just some guidance we think is reasonable and could be used by staff in order to provide good advice to council in those circumstances where public hearing is optional.
I guess the headings are quite big, but the examples are like, there's not really an example. Like, what's an example of environment and climate where we would be given an opportunity to have a public hearing or not?
Sure. Environment is an easy one. If, let's say, we had a rezoning come in that was proposing to develop an environmentally sensitive area, say in close proximity to a creek or stream, or it would be in a significant hazard area that wasn't mitigated in terms of its potential risk to the community. These are kinds of examples of things where staff would consider recommending that an optional public hearing be held.
And then industrial lands and employment. There could be a big, huge building built, or there could be amendment to use.
Yeah, so again, if it's a big, huge building, it might not be consistent with the OCP. So it sort of depends. There might be multiple things that it might impact, or it might precipitate a lot of public input and concern through the project information meeting. So, I don't think any of these are exclusive categories. I think these are essentially some general guidance for staff to help us give good advice to council on when to hold a public hearing.
Councillor Murray mentioned right at the end of those comments about a change in use. Can you comment on a change in use on industrial properties?
Yeah, so in many circumstances, changes in use on industrial properties are relatively minor. We have some industrial properties that were created as CD or site-specific zones many years ago, and sometimes developers simply want to make an adjustment to change the area of the use or increase a use that was maybe quite limited with the CD zone that was created potentially decades ago. So those are the kind of industrial changes that we often see in industrial zones. However, I'll give an example. We have current applications where there's significant changes in industrial land, such as allowing a currently prohibited use that has a environmental hazard or a hazard associated with it. That would clearly be something that I think staff would recommend to council a public hearing be held.
But it would be up to staff to determine whether you were going to make that recommendation or not. I guess so Mike, the mayor's saying no, but Mr. Milburn, you're saying yes? I'm not sure.
It's a recommendation. That's all it is. And then you would...
council can still choose to have the hearing or not.
Correct. At first reading, you can make that choice. That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Back.
Thank you, Mayor Little. My question was with regards to the notice requirement. If we're moving that up in the timeline and we're waiving a public hearing, would the requirement change at all? In other words, like, are we providing the public more of an opportunity with some expanded outreach if it's decided that a public hearing won't be held? Does the requirement change?
Yeah, happy to jump in there, Your Worship. The clerk can certainly add to this too. When I think about the public notification requirements set out in the Act for circumstances where a public hearing is recommended not to be held, they pretty much mirror the requirements for a public hearing, except that the notice simply indicates council will be considering first reading, as opposed to council will be holding a public hearing. But it's signage, it's delivery of notice to neighbors, and it's notice in the newspaper. And as well, in addition to that, we put notice on our website. So it's all the same notification following council's standard as set out in bylaw.
Would we have the option to potentially enhance it in those situations so that the public, if they know that the process could potentially move faster without a public hearing? Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry about that. I muted myself. So yeah, the requirements are minimum requirements in the Local Government Act. Those can be enhanced. We would just want to specify that the development procedures bylaw. If council felt there was some kind of enhanced public notice that the community would benefit from. I think if there was some kind of enhancing notice, I would suggest the community would benefit either way. So I would suggest that we would do that for the notice of first reading or notice of public hearing if there was some improvement the council felt was necessary. I think we'd want to give you some advice on that because every notice has, of course, consequences in terms of cost and time and all those kinds of issues. Happy to chat about that more, but that's my advice would be if you enhance it for one, I would enhance it for both.
Okay, that's fair. I think it is a conversation that I would like us to have because it does change things. Public hearings were, for a lot of people, they knew that was a key moment to be able to weigh in on any given application. So I would want us to look at some ways of just improving the outreach, across the board.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Murray.
Just on that, I mean, a good example would be Emery Village, for instance, where the minimum was 2 signs that were indeed placed. One was in the cul-de-sac off Mountain Highway, and the other one was at the entrance to a trail within Kirkstone Park. But I think the important part here was it was the minimum that needed to be implemented, which is what happened, rather than going above the minimum during such a contentious hearing and making sure that it was very widely advertised to the broad community. And so, I keep hearing time and cost and these hearings are for the broad community and the immediate community to understand the impact of what is going on in a specific area. That's the democratic part and that quasi-judicial role that we play in this process. And, I'd really like to see what the savings is, 1 month. For me, these projects are very, a lot of them are very big. I'm not really sure, at what scale we're even talking about a hearing. There could be, 3 homes being rezoned to, a small 4-story complex. It could be a changing use on a site from one use to another. They could be very large, very big, and I understand that we have the option, but I think we should be communicating with the community far more than we have been in the last 10 years. And we should be asking ourselves why we have so few people showing up. Maybe they just don't know about it, like last night. People that were immediately impacted had really no idea about what was going on. So I do think that we should look at, what kind of connection we're actually making to determine if, 4 weeks is such a massive savings against the opportunity for people to be able to speak to council. It really does erode the role we play.
Mr. Milburn, response?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a couple minor points. Certainly, it has been recognized by council since a number of years ago when the Emery Place rezoning occurred that improved signage requirements would benefit the community, and the development procedures bylaw was updated. And now signs are placed on the adjacent collector arterial road. They're double-sided signs. So yeah, there's additional signage that occurs. In terms of the process, staff are recommending it simply because council's given us some direction in the past to look at ways to improve efficiency to assist homeowners and businesses with speedier processes. And so that can be done in many ways. This is just one of them. If council feels that this is a step too far and would like to continue to receive reports in advance of first reading and then debate whether or not to hold a public hearing, that's totally fine. That's council's preview. This is just one option for council's consideration. Thank you.
We should probably carry on with the presentation at this point. Mr. Budge? Is there not another part to it? Yeah.
That's odd. Mr. Budge, we're hearing a strange chipmunk voice. Is everybody else hearing that? Okay.
No, it's just you, Dan. No.
Yes, now you're scaring me.
Okay. We heard it, but I think what it was, unfortunately, the Zoom system, when it gets behind, it tries to catch up by speeding up a person's voice. And so I think that's what we heard there. Hopefully it's caught up. We'll go back to Mr. Budge. It's Alvin and the Chipmunks. I don't know if you need to.
He's in the municipal hall here. We've tried to keep staff close just in case there was any technical issues. Maybe Graham, just advance to the next slide, and maybe I'll speak while council can hear me. So Graham, are you able to advance the presentation? If not, Lisa, are you able to? Oh, here, good. Okay, he can advance it. So development permit delegation, and advance to the next slide, please. I wouldn't bother talking, Graham. It's not going to work for the time being. So maybe just highlight the three boxes on this slide, please. So just so council's familiar with, there's delegated development permits already occur. If there are permits related to the protection of the natural environment or hazardous conditions, or really small projects, those are currently delegated to staff. And in part, that's because for environment and natural hazards, we rely extensively on professional reports, as well as the review by professional staff of those reports. And if the project does not comply with the guidelines, then it's denied. And then the applicant can seek appeal through council if they feel that the permit should have been issued. In the case of minor development permits, these are sort of form and character development permits on commercial industrial buildings. They're for very small projects, though. We're talking about like a storage room kind of size of impact on the site. So that's currently what's delegated. And Graham, we keep flipping between your various views. So is there a way to just advance the slides without clicking between the views? Let's do that. Okay, good. So what we're recommending is a slight enhancement in the delegation to staff. And this slide gives an example of the things that would continue to be decided by council. So we're talking about, commercial mixed-use developments, residential and town and village center development permits. All of these would continue to go to council, and council would be able to hear feedback and debate whether or not the guidelines are being achieved, and therefore whether or not to issue the permit. Next slide, please. What we're recommending in this circumstance is that there are certain development permits within industrial areas where there are more limited guidelines in terms of the aesthetic. We're really trying to achieve a much simpler building form. And in those circumstances, we're recommending be delegated to staff. Next slide. Here are some other form and character guideline drawings, or images and drawings showing proposed development. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a major industrial project development permit. Next slide. And another. So you can see these buildings don't usually have a high aesthetic standard. Essentially, are we able to hear you now, Graham? No.
Perfect. No, it's not coming through clearly. It's definitely a brilliant problem. I know. I think Mr. Newman's in the room. I think you're on the second floor. Is that right, Graham? I don't know if we can have IT go and check his headset connection, but Mr. Milburn, are you able to carry on with the presentation?
I can. Yeah, I do. I apologize. I don't have Graham's notes. Maybe Graham, if you could forward, just email me your notes that you're using, and then I can make sure I refer to the things you've identified as important.
Why don't we take a 3-minute stretch here? And I see IT is with Graham right now. Let's get that, see if we can get it fixed. Otherwise, we'll pass the notes on or swap Mr. Budge over to Mr. Milburn's computer.
How's now?
Yeah, that's clear.
Great.
All right. Well, never mind. No break needed. Thank you to IT. Back to you, Mr. Budge.
Could I ask
Right.
a question?
We haven't had the presentation yet.
Well, just we went through a bunch of slides.
Yeah, it's going through all those slides, and we went through them so quickly, and they're referring to minor form and character. Is there a list of minor form and character things?
Well, I'll maybe let Graham jump in if that's possible. Your worship, and just identify the difference between what's currently delegated and what we're recommending in this report.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for allowing me to backtrack there now that the microphone is working. So as Dan mentioned, there's existing delegated development permits, and we're not talking about those tonight. We're talking about the commercial and mixed-use development. We're not talking about residential and town and village center development. Those are going to remain a council decision. We're making a recommendation that council delegate the authority to staff to consider industrial development permits when use and density are met. So we're not talking about zoning either here. We're talking about industrial development permits that relate to form and character guidelines. Again, going through the slide a second time here, when we talk about industrial form and character guidelines, they're quite straightforward. While there are guidelines, they mostly have to do with the functionality of sites. So we're talking about circulation, loading, staging, landscaping, and some edge details when adjacent to other use types. But in the case of, like the really isolated industrial development sites that we talked about during the November 3 meeting, it's industry that knows best how to functionally design their site. So here are a couple of examples going through a second time of such sites where, while it is important for staff to review and consider what can be done to ensure development meets those guidelines, the form and character for industrial development permit guidelines, it can be said that industry knows best. So we're talking about delegating to staff the consideration of form and character permits when related to industrial development. So that's what category 2 is about. And if Councillor Forbes, if we could get into, I'd be happy to talk more about minor permits right now, but there's also going to be a third category to this presentation that talks about changes to the minor development permit process. So I'd be happy to talk about the differences between major and minor right now. Minor development permits are development permits for form and character. So it is that urban design development permit area that we've talked about at the last meeting.
Graham, can we just pause for a sec before you go into a long description of the difference? Maybe Councillor Forbes, your worship, if we can just clarify, you've now seen the presentation twice very quickly. I apologize. Can we just clarify the question that you're seeking with respect to the delegated development permit issuance, which is this topic?
Apparently there's something more coming down the road here, so I'm quite willing to wait and see what comes up.
Thank you.
So now I'll invite discussion at the end of the second section of this presentation.
Councillor Murray?
I think Councillor Hanson, I'll wait until Councillor Hanson speaks.
Councillor Hanson?
Thank you, Worship. Thank you, Councillor Murray. This was one of the reasons I wanted to have the workshop, because I wasn't able to conceptualize in my mind what a form and character development permit. I guess to make it really simple, could you give us an example of the form and character development permit on an industrial site that will now be within staff jurisdiction, which isn't currently within staff jurisdiction? If you could, thank you, Mr. Budge.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we don't have too many industrial development permits in the district, but we do have some very valuable sites within the industrial use class. Here is an example. This is the FiberCo site, just south of West First Street, south of the iconic North Shore wastewater treatment plant site. And this was for an upgrade to the terminal infrastructure and the terminal facilities. And this was an example of a case that was presented to council for their consideration in the late 2010s, I think it was. And so this is an exact example of what would be considered at the staff level should you support this delegation of authority.
So it's simply the determination of the issuance of this industrial development permit and a consideration whether it complies with form and character guidelines.
That's correct, the form and character guidelines. Of course,
it's not that you're giving yourself discretion necessarily to vary those form and character guidelines. It's just to consider whether this industrial development permit actually complies with the guidelines instead of having council make that determination.
Yes, that's correct. And then, and just to be clear, that's after zoning conditions are met. So, if it was a process where an application for rezoning was also submitted, that would be council's decision.
Thank you, Mr. Budge. And just one other, thank you for that. I somehow, thank you. So how many of these would there be in a typical year in the district?
I don't have the exact permit data, but I can say that there's a variety of scales. So this here is an example of a quite heavy industrial site. But then we also have light industrial sites, and then we have the employment zone light industrial sites, for example, in the Pemberton corridor. So there's a variety of scales. The smaller scale permits occur more frequently. Sometimes they're quite minor, and in many cases, it's an authority that's already delegated to staff in the form of the minor development.
Right.
So we're talking about more of these larger scale sites, and I'm going to get into more examples of smaller cases in the subsequent section. So,
in terms of the larger ones, though, there's probably just a couple a year or one a year kind of thing.
Yeah, it's quite minor. I think in 2024 was one.
Thank you very much, Mr. Budge.
Okay. Councillor Back.
Yes, thank you. I'm just wanting to confirm that this would not extend to industrial intensification, like it's just talking about form and character. I was wondering, given our long-term employment land protection goals, this delegation would it support tenant improvements as well as intensification of industrial, or would that still remain with council, that kind of decision?
Mr. Budge.
There are instances where smaller scale tenant improvements may involve a development permit for industrial development that isn't within staff's current authority. So yes, there's a potential that this delegation would benefit tenant improvement applications.
No.
Your worship, just to clarify, Councillor Back, just to confirm, we're all speaking the same language. What do you mean by intensification? Do you mean a change in zoning that would increase the amount of area that could be built on the property? If that's the case, then that would continue to be a council decision.
Sure,
if it's simply whether or not the proposal if it complies with the existing zoning, and they simply want to develop in accordance with the existing zoning. And at that point, we look at the design of the structures in terms of parking access, simple landscaping, orientation to the street, very basic factors with industrial. Those would be delegated to staff under this proposal. Thanks.
So if they were looking to add floor area, it would still remain a council decision.
Yeah, floor area beyond the existing zoning would still remain with council. Development permits couldn't increase, change the use or change the density. Those would be zoning decisions.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Councillor Murray.
So just on that point, we have properties that have not necessarily maxed out at their higher zoning.
That's correct. We have many properties that are, some are vacant, some are underutilized or underdeveloped or could have some infill. There's lots of properties that aren't fully developed to what the current zoning allows. That's correct.
Yeah. So then this delegation could be quite significant if they're within their existing zoning.
Significant in the sense that a major project such as the one shown in this drawing could be approved. But I would just remind council that development permits aren't actually a discretional tool. They're not like rezoning. They can't be refused for arbitrary reasons. They can only be refused for, of course, lack of compliance to the existing zoning. You could refuse it, or in some way the guidelines weren't being achieved. Then a permit could be refused.
So I think the part, though, that we keep missing is, like, are we as a council meant to understand what is going on in the community? And through these processes, we generally have a good idea because we're part of these decisions. And if we're passing everything to staff and we're not understanding what could be a significant change to a piece of property simply because they had not maxed out on their existing zoning, we would never hear about it. And, there is that role that we play in communicating what's going on, regardless of whether or not a development permit can be refused. It's, information that the community wants to hear. And that is a direct reflection on what the OCP is about. It seems like we're more and more cementing all of these things in, rigidly, as opposed to the flexibility of a living OCP and the changes that can come with changes to OCPs. Like when you put the slide up for form and character, and that's the Dollarton Business Park, you've got a photo there. I'm not sure why that photo is the one being used for the example. That was a comprehensive development zone. That development was intentionally designed like that, right down to the windows, the reflection of the windows, because it sits in a migratory bird path. That's why the windows, and it was the glazing of those windows were a very integral part of the sustainability of that development. And the treed border, because it was a forest, the pathways through the development. So I'm just wondering, is this an example purely to describe form and character, or is this an example of what could change in the future with delegating this process to staff?
Mr. Milburn?
Graham can certainly jump in. This is an example of, I believe, a kind of development that is industrial in nature that would be delegated to staff, and then staff would issue it if it complied with council's guidelines in the official community plan, or refuse it if it does not.
So this development was a piece of bare land that needed to be rezoned. So this type of development wouldn't be at the discretion of staff. It would have to still go through a process.
Yeah, if it needed rezoning, absolutely. The rezoning decisions continue to remain with council either way. Staff can never issue bylaws. That's the one thing we definitely can't do. We can never issue a bylaw.
I'm
Just to
looking.
clarify that just for a sec. So these types of developments, aren't they comprehensive developments? This one as an example of a comprehensive development. And is there latent zoning in a comprehensive development typically?
Your worship, they're typically fully built to the permitted density that was approved by council.
So if they wanted to change to a comprehensive development because they are tailored to the previous development, you would need to still bring it forward.
It would still need to come and get a bylaw change. If they were looking at building a larger building, increasing the density, and changing the use, that would be coming to council still. Only council can approve zoning bylaw changes.
So we're generally talking about the things that are under the normal general zones like I3 through I7 or whatever else the case may be, not CD zones. Okay.
I'm just wondering about things like you talk about Fiberco, and I remember when we did that rezoning on Fiberco, and one of the important parts of that rezoning was the netting that went up along the elevators, because at the time there was a very significant impact to the local communities. We had a lot of car, we had spray booths, car automotive on Pemberton. And there was an issue around the dust fibers that were coming off of the plant. And so when they did go to a rezoning, council and the community were very vocal about including a system that would reduce that. I mean, cars at C-SPAN all had covers on them because when they came out at the end of their shift, it was covered in dust, chips. So, that was something that was added in. So I just, how are those things going to get picked up? How is the community going to be represented when an applicant simply walks in the door and staff gets to approve it without us even knowing about it?
Thank you, Worship. Happy to respond to that question. So Councillor Muri is raising issues that are outside of a development permit. So a form and character development permit can't control air quality measures. It can't control offsite works. It can't do any of those things. And so in circumstances where there is a rezoning, council, where concerns and issues have been raised, what typically council would do is require that those be mitigated in some way. And so possibly a covenant on title is secured, or an agreement that the developer will act in a certain way. And so that's guaranteed through that process. And then staff at the time of the building permit application would verify that whatever condition council agreed and set on the property through covenant was achieved. But that's outside of a development permit process. And I really want to emphasize that a development permit is just form and character. It cannot be refused for any other reason than compliance with the guidelines. It's much like a building permit in that way. We issue building permits if they comply with the BC Building Code and other safety measures, but they can't be refused for other reasons unrelated to a building permit. So it's very, very similar to a building permit in that sense.
Yeah, again, I just have to go back to the fact that the public, regardless of whether they are unable to be refused, it's important for the public to understand what is going on. It's important for the public's representatives, council, to also understand. So that's what I feel kind of is at stake here for this need for speed, because we just lose sort of that democratic process. It's been sort of applied to us. And so a lot of these things are seen as ways to make things quicker. But the devil's in the details. I don't know if these examples are the minimum amount of what staff could delegate versus the maximum amount. I have no way of comparing. There's pictures with sort of a before and after, and then there's a bunch of just pictures of different, like a salt shed and a container area with a roof, and then another picture with a circle indicating a small area in a large industrial field. I'm not sure what those pictures are depicting. I don't know why they're there.
Sure. So maybe I'll answer the first question first. And so that was around how does the public become aware of these? And so we're not recommending any change to the public engagement process associated with these development permits. In the case of these applications where we receive a preliminary or detailed application, in the detailed application area, council has said that there needs to be public engagement at that preliminary, that information meeting that I talked about earlier in the presentation. So those would still occur, and council would be made aware of those through an information report, and staff would assess the feedback received. I would also note that when in the current circumstance, when council considers a development permit, there is no public notice attached to council's consideration if it's simply a development permit. All there is the development permit is placed on council's agenda for consideration.
Which is public notice.
It's public notice.
Public
There is notice associated with that, but there isn't any additional notice like you would have with a rezoning, like signs on the property and in the adjacent area, notice to neighbors and notice in the newspaper. None of those occur with a development permit because it isn't a hearing. That's not council's consideration. It's simply a matter on the agenda for council's consideration. So what we're suggesting is that we would continue the public engagement process that is currently followed for development permits in terms of public notification, the information being on our website and so on.
I know, and I'll just end Mayor Little just to maybe explain why this is making me nervous is because, you know, the OCP has been generally consistent from the day it was, you know, supported by council in 2010 to now. And yet, you know, over the last 10 years, you can see the difference in and I know we're not talking about use and density. I know we're not talking about residential, but what we've seen in residential and the changes of where the lot lines are and the density of those residential applications in some cases have been quite significant. And I know that those decisions are up to council, but you know, we put these guidelines in and, you know, if you looked at Mount Seymour Parkway on one side of Parkgate, you know, the setbacks to a residential development are quite different from the ones on the east or the west side. And really in the OCP and the local area plan, nothing really changed, but the units are closer to the road. There's more density, there's less trees. It's all around a denser development. So I just, you know, I just want to understand the impacts of these for the community because, you know, things change when you're not even looking.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments. Councillor Ma.
Sorry, I'm just trying to remember my question now. And, you know, maybe this is to do with language and Mayor Little might have touched upon this, and you know there was some discussion earlier about underutilized sites. So, and I think Mr. Milburn, you mentioned that most sites are already at their maximum. So, I just want to understand because in the past you've used the word intensification. So, if a site is underutilized and they want to increase their activity, but it's still under the max allowed, is that intensification, which means that it would come back to council, or are they allowed to build up to their?
Mayor Little, I think Councillor Ma has frozen on my screen. Is that your case in yours?
Yes.
Okay, I believe I understood the question.
Not just frozen, he may have dropped off. Oh, no, there he is. He's just got a blank screen.
Okay, I believe I understood the question. It was, what does intensification mean when it comes to industrial? Okay, so it's a broad term. It doesn't have like a technical or legal definition. In the case of light industrial, intensification typically means development that increases the amount of employment and activity on the site. And in the case of heavy industrial, it typically means an increasing amount of throughput of goods and through the site. So it's a broad term used in the industry. When we spoke about it earlier, the idea of intensification, I understood Councillor Back was referring to it as an increase in permitted use, as in, let's say, a circumstance where the existing zoning allows 1 story of development and the proponent wants to do 2 stories. let's say, of industrial development, and the current zoning doesn't permit it. That was what I understood Councillor Back to be thinking as some kind of intensification that requires a change in the zoning of the property. And of course, whenever there's a change in zoning, that must be a council decision. Those can't be delegated to staff.
Sorry, I kind of missed the first part.
Sure. Yeah.
So you talked about, increasing throughput and stuff. Sorry, I just missed that first part. If you can just.
Yeah, I was just saying, in the industry, people refer to intensification in different ways.
Okay.
In light industry, it often means, some development that increases the amount of employment or activity on the site. In heavy industry, it often means increasing amount of throughput on the site, so goods moving through the site, such as on a port. But I explained that what I understood Councillor Back was referring to is intensification that would be a change in use or density necessitating a bylaw amendment. In those circumstances,
in those cases, it'll come back to council.
Always to council. Yeah, staff can't approve bylaws. Yeah.
But a business that wants to just increase throughput by potentially building another, I don't know, well, maybe that's not a good example, but this increasing throughput, they don't necessarily need to come back before council.
That's what we're proposing. We're proposing that if they're, say, doing some development on the site, so constructing, say, a pole shed or an open-sided building, an addition, that instead staff would simply look at council's guidelines that are set out in the OCP and apply those guidelines and issue the permit if it complied with them.
Okay.
All right. Carrying on.
Great, thank you. And now moving on to part 3 of the presentation, which is a batch of general administrative improvements, which really represent housekeeping amendments to the OCP related to, again, development permits, but more generally. So since the OCP went into effect, there have been delegated authority development permits. We just mentioned that. And more recently, their 2023 council delegated minor variances to staff. But there's a clause in the OCP that doesn't allow delegated development permits if they include variances. So this was a relic from the OCP prior to minor variances existing. So the staff recommendation, staff's proposal for this administrative batch of improvements would be to fix that inconsistency and allow delegated development permits with minor variances. So I'll get more into the details about minor variances in the following section. But I do want to show a couple of examples of, for us here, a couple examples of development permits that also include variance permits. So this is 15th Street West, the site of a new brewery location in the Pemberton Light Industrial area. Many of the buildings in this and like areas are from the 50 years or older, so maybe from the 1960s. I think this one, often they have 0 lot line setbacks, the front and the sides. Generally, there's insufficient space for the modern, comparatively more modern parking requirements. So variance requests are really common when there's a change of uses in these areas. So at this site, there was, in fact, staff authority development permit for the building upgrades, the facade upgrades, as you can see here in the images. And there was also a request for a variance because the parking requirement was unable to be met. So from the applicant's perspective, administratively, these were, as well as administratively, these were 2 separate permits. And I think when you're an applicant, that can look kind of weird from their experience. So the proposed change would allow that delegated development permit to be hybridized with the minor variances, allowing for obvious efficiencies associated with being able to administer these 2 together. They both exist as a staff authority, and the administrative improvement would just allow them to be hybridized as a uniform permit. So there's efficiencies to be had there. And I've got another example of such a site where efficiency of a combined delegated authority development permit with a minor variance it just makes sense. As I mentioned, a lot of the sites in areas like this, and a lot of small and local serving businesses are fitting into existing and often older sites like this. So in retaining the building, there's often variances associated with a request for development proposal. So a regulatory streamlining like this, even if minor, will have a cumulative benefit to staff efficiency, as well as I mentioned earlier, the improved customer benefit. And we've consistently heard from the business community, and we've heard from council as well, that making these kind of improvements towards simplifying and streamlining the regulatory process and the experience of our applicants is important. So this would do that. So moving on to another example, still within that batch of administrative improvements. So these next few slides relate to, again, development permits, but I want to talk about it in the context of reasonableness. So this is also something that we've heard from council, from the public, and from business, as well as from the Dapper consultant, the topic of reasonableness. So, reasonableness in the right sizing of process. And I would call upon an example, just like we don't make homeowners get permits for sheds below 10 square meters, sometimes we shouldn't be requiring that of other permit types. And so I want to call on a couple examples of that. So here is an example of what is technically a structure that is over the square footage threshold that requires it to be a council-issued development permit. But this would benefit from a reasonable approach and be treated at the staff level. So the administrative improvement that we're proposing as part of this OCP text amendment would basically give staff the discretion to make a judgment call, a reasonable judgment call, that things like this, that they're technically major development, but can reasonably be treated as minor, and for all intents and purposes should be treated as minor, regardless of the technicality. So another example here, just one sort of step down. This is something that is minor within the OCP definition of minor development permit, but taking a reasonable approach, this could be considered exempt from the need for a development permit altogether. So the administrative improvement would allow some staff discretion to take a reasonable approach, which is something that we've consistently heard feedback on.
Is parking able to be varied?
Yes, minor variance allows staff the authority to issue off-street parking requirements. I'll get to that in the next section. I just want to call on one more example before we enter discussion. And actually, this example is good for two. It's good for the previous category, talking about industrial delegation of permits, but also it's still talking about that reasonableness of an approach. So there's a blank screen there. Oh, here we go. So this is like a typical rib peaked frame. This is actually, I don't know if you can see the dimensions, but this is like an 18 by 9 meter structure. So it's a big structure, certainly surpasses the floor area threshold for a form and character development permit. But you can imagine once it's enclosed, it has a canvas canopy or corrugated metal exterior or something like that. And structures like these are typically to enclose something, could be bulk materials or like a sanding operation or something that would otherwise cause maybe painting, something that should be or maybe is required to be enclosed. But then if we consider the proposal of such a structure within the scale of its own site, and this is an example I used in the November 3rd presentation, if we consider it within the scale of its own site, an approach of reasonableness would treat this as minor, not as major, because when we see it's isolated within its own site, which is a large area, it really, although it passes the technical threshold, it's within its own site area, it's quite isolated and minor comparative scale.
Is it enclosed?
Yes. The schematic is just doesn't show the enclosure, but yes. So and that concludes the third part of the presentation. And to recap, the batch of administrative improvements would allow for delegated DP with minor variances. So delegation paired with delegation, which was just a relic from the OCP that wasn't changed at the time of minor variance delegation. And it would encourage, it would establish this reasonable approach for staff's ability to treat things as minor when they should be minor, or perhaps exempt when sufficiently minor. So I'd like to invite some discussion or any questions about this section before moving on to part 4.
Great, thank you. Councillor Hanson.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Budge. It's certainly useful seeing it laid out step by step with it like this. I think in our last discussion on earlier November, one of the places we got caught up is in the definition of minor. Now, if I heard you right, you said that minor is a contextual definition and has to do with the reasonableness of the variance being issued along with the along with the development permit, as opposed to it being a matter that involves a sufficient concern that it ought to go to council. So the word minor somehow gets defined through this concept of reasonableness, or I guess proportionality of what's being done versus the variance. Are there any other more specific criteria for minor, or Mr. Budge, any more way of clarifying what's minor versus not minor when it comes to the variance permit that will go along with the development permit, or the minor variance that will go along with the development permit? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for the question. It looks like Dan was eager to respond there. Did you want to take that one, Dan?
Sure. Just I'll start and then feel free to jump in. So through your worship, so we're getting into the definition of minor a little bit more in the last item. In this particular recommendation, if we go back, Graham, to your original slide here, all we're suggesting is that in circumstances, generally where there is a development permit and a minor variance associated with it, that potentially that could then be, since those are under a recommendation delegated to staff, that staff could then issue a development permit with a minor variance as well. And just to clarify, people can apply for a variance separately with a development variance permit, or technically they can say, I'd like to vary the bylaw using the development permit I'm already applying for. Okay, we typically only do that, of course, if it's a matter related to the guidelines, like they're proposing to vary something related to achieving one of the development permit guidelines in terms of the form and character. In the next section, we're going to be talking about in much more depth the definition of what is a minor variance. because we have a recommendation to slightly increase that definition. But it was a question that Councillor Muri raised specifically. I think Councillor Hansen is asking it. What is minor? And the act, the Local Government Act, which sets out the rules for council, essentially says that council would need to define the criteria for what is minor. And that is done in the Development Procedures Bylaw. And in the subsequent presentation, there's a description of the criteria that council has set out for staff to follow to determine whether or not the variance is minor. And we're happy to walk through that in detail, because I think that's where it seems to be where council's questions are going in this regard. So we're happy to move to that next section of the slide, or presentation, pardon me. I just want to see if there's,
You have
that's
like,
all right.
If
If there's
I
any other
could,
question, is there any other question related to these particular slides here before
Yeah, our
we
hands
dive into minor?
if I could just clarify then, so what we're talking about in number 3 here is merely the right to pair the delegated development permit with a minor variance and have it both dealt with in staff. In section 4, we're going to talk about what a minor variance is, and you're going to talk about an expansion of that.
Correct. We'll get much deeper into the minor variance issue in the next section. That's correct.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'd like to just expand on Dan's response there, because Councillor Hansen, it sounded like you were asking about what makes a minor development, because that is a defined term in the OC as well. And it is a very prescriptive threshold. It's floor area based. And as I mentioned, the reasonableness approach that was in the back half of this section 3, it encourages, it's a text amendment to the OCP forming character minor definition to allow for a reasonableness approach to say,
okay, two
like
different
this,
terms.
which
I want
are
to be really
technically over
clear,
that
Graham.
floor area threshold that I mentioned. But
two different terms, Graham. Can I
a
just stop you there for a moment?
reasonable approach would say that within the scale of its own site, even though it's over that 100 square meter threshold, it's sufficiently minor to be dealt with at the staff level.
There we go. Two different terms with the word minor in them, and I'll just clarify the difference for council. Okay, a minor variance is essentially a variance to something like a zoning bylaw or regulation. Okay, so it's a change from the existing zoning permitted through a variance approval, being minor in nature. What Graham was referring to is a minor development. Okay, so this is a small building, or a building which is small in scale relative to the industrial site it's located in. Okay, so two different terms. I just want to clarify that. Any questions with respect to what is a minor variance versus a minor development?
I still do have a speaking order, and we're going to get to much further discussion about minor. So can I have the questions focus on portion 3 before we get to 2? Councillor Hansen, are you satisfied with your questions on 3?
Yes, thank you very much, Your Worship.
Okay. Councillor Ma.
Thank you. I just want to start by saying I generally support delegated authority. I just want to put that out front. But there were, under the administrative improvements, there were 2 examples. Graham, can you go back? Hi, Graham. Can you go back a few slides to the 2 examples you have tend to be or happen to be brew pubs in near where I live. So there was Bridge Brewing, and then there was Beva. If you can just move back to those slides. Sorry, can you hear me? Okay. Are you? Well, okay. We'll just leave it. There's a lot of discussion about discretion and reasonableness, and on both.
Okay.
I can't hear Councillor Ma anymore, Your Worship.
Sorry, Councillor Ma, it's cutting in and out again. Try your question again right now.
Okay. From the start, I generally support delegated authority. the two examples you have happen to be two brew pubs that were being developed near where I live, and the owners reached out to me when they ran into some challenges. I just want to talk about discretion and reasonableness. Can you help me to understand, when the authority is going to be delegated, to whom and like to what level? And a follow-up question to that, we seem to have some new staff, and is there plans to have some training for these staff just to establish those, do that kind of thing? So just to have some consistency. So, it's not like if an applicant came in and got person A one day and their discretion was, yeah, go ahead, or don't do it. And then they came in the next day and that person says, yeah, this is okay, go ahead. Like, how are you going to manage that?
Go pee-pee.
Yeah.
Graham, I'll maybe just jump in there because that authority is delegated to me under the bylaw. So it's essentially the general manager of planning, properties, and permits is delegated authority to issue,
Okay.
and then or anyone indicated in writing to act on my behalf. So I typically would delegate that to the manager of community development, but it wouldn't be delegated to frontline staff who are processing the application. They'd be working with the applicant in the day-to-day matters, resolving issues. And then they would make a recommendation that would then be decided by either the manager or the general manager.
Okay, thank you.
I would love to expand on that as well a little bit. And this is where this content sort of bridges the regulation to the intent of the DAPR project, because there are these bylaws, they are regulation, but they also make up a procedure, right? So when the procedure is improved, this is a procedure that perhaps new staff, like you suggested, they reference in doing their work. So to clarify a procedure, to reduce ambiguity, to allow for a reasonableness approach, it does improve staff's ability to do their work.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Back.
Yes, thank you. My question was with respect to climate ready sort of upgrades. If we know climate action is a part of core part of our direction, and I'm just wondering if delegation will help speed up approvals for things like retrofits, things like heat pumps and EV ready upgrades.
Graham, maybe I'll just jump in there because I think the question is referring to questions around heat pumps or potentially solar panels or other things. So that's a building permit process efficiency. And so staff have actually, working with industry, looked at a number of ways to improve that process. And in the past, we've even recommended slight modifications to the bylaws of the district to help speed that process up. If the permit isn't related to what we're talking about here, so it's not, a new shed, a new structure, if it's just simply like a solar panel being installed on a roof or some energy efficient appliance being installed in the building, we absolutely look at trying to apply the most efficient trade permit or building permit approval process in those circumstances, because they're often straightforward engineered appliances and fixtures. And so we've worked closely with industry to speed that process up. And Ms. Stahlem, I'm sure can comment on that as well. I know she's been part of those efficiency discussions internally.
Stahlem, do you have a comment? You are muted. There you go.
Sorry about that. Working on so many improvements to all of these processes to speed these up. We have a number of things underway to help with the trade permits that are associated with each of these applications. And we made a number of improvements to the building process that surrounds it a couple of years ago. But the upcoming work that we're going to see is around heat pumps, especially trying to make that easier for the applicants. It's a bit cumbersome at the moment and a little bit more than it needs to be. And so we're working on getting some improvements underway as soon as we can for that.
Thank you. So for heat pumps specifically, those improvements will be coming up when? In the new year?
In the new year, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank
you. Okay, Councillor Murray.
Just on the heat pump issue, are we going to be requiring any kind of sound mitigation for the heat pumps?
We anticipated that discussion yet?
We raised that issue in a workshop previously with council. We had baffling and noise abatement, and also the location of the heat pump and fan in the backyard versus the side yard. And when that was brought forward to council in a workshop at that time, council didn't direct any changes to the bylaw requirements with respect to the location of the heat pump on the property.
Maybe we should run that by just council and see what they think, because, you know, there are different people that have, I moved into an area with 2 heat pumps, and as soon as I moved in, both neighbors said, you know, does the sound bother you at all? Because they're even aware of it. So it might be something that we consider. So my question would be, as an example, given the shed example on the large piece of industrial land, would the structure on Old Dollarton at Dykoff be under a delegated permit?
I would expect, based on the floor area, through the mayor to councilor Murray, I would expect through based on the size of the structure, yes, that would be the subject of what we're talking about here. Delegated. Sorry, I should say the subject of the previous category of
a delegated
issue.
Development permit.
Yep. To be clear, it's on a top. Does that make a difference in your consideration?
Thank you very much for the question, Your Worship. When applications are typically on district-owned land, as the Dykoff Nursery is, council has layers of control and approval, including the in that case the temporary use permit. In addition, the lease of the property, so council approves the lease, and then finally the development permit is really just looking at the form and character, and we're recommending that those types of industrial projects in that circumstance could be delegated with this recommendation.
So regardless of whether it's a TUP or not, this Dykoff's structure, there's 2. That size, could it be bigger? And it be delegated?
Let Graham jump in with respect to the size of industrial project as being recommended by staff for delegation.
Well, it's complicated when it comes to do with the TUP.
No, let's just get rid of the TUP. We'll just remove the TUP out of it. If there was an applicant that came along that wanted to build something along the same size or even bigger than what's at Dykoff right now, that would be an example of a project that would be delegated through the delegated development permit process.
It would be delegated so long as they were meeting their zoning allowances for density. If they were going above that, then of course rezoning would have to be proposed, and that would be within council's discretion to decide upon.
And you're going to talk about the parking in the next section. So I guess I'm really interested in understanding and seeing a map of when somebody walks in the door, and we'll use Dykoff as an example. When they walk in the door and they say, okay, I want to build this, and it's basically a tin box. It's basically what it is. And the process that they have to go through, because I'm not sure how much this delegation, when that TUP was already delegated through staff, that project took nearly, over 2.5 years from start to finish. And it was only a 3-year TUP with an extension. So I guess I need to understand at some point what exactly we're doing and how much time are we exactly saving when a metal box takes that long on a piece of property, because it's not just the box, it's the floodplain it sits on, the foundation, the parking, the access. So we're seeing a very small part of a process, and being encouraged to believe that we're going to speed things up. But are we really? And DICOF was delegated to staff because it was a TUP, and it still took a painfully long time with it going back and forth and back and forth. And that's the biggest complaint we continually get. And I think it's really important, Mayor Little, for staff or for council to understand what is this process and why does it take so long, even for a simple metal box, much like the shed that Mr. Budge put up there that was enclosed on the big industrial land. There's safety to those buildings. There, snow load, wind, all sorts of things with a structure like that. So I think that's the part we're kind of missing in this presentation. For me, that's what I'm missing. I still don't really understand what the great savings is in time, how the costs that we're saving. I don't know what it is. Is it $100, $10,000, 50,000? What is it? I have no idea. Are there still as many touch points as there are that the application will still have to go through?
Mr. Budge.
Yeah, so I'd be happy to answer a couple of the questions there. When Councillor Murray, so in the matter of delegation, we do have a recent example of the benefit of delegating from council to staff decisions. So when minor variances were delegated to staff in 2023, after a year of permitting data, we were able to analyze the processing timelines, and it was measured that there was a 30 to 40% reduction in processing time associated with the decision being considered and decided upon at the staff level. So there is a tangible benefit to applicants, but I think also I need to respond to, in the case of Old Dollarton, it's in a flood area. It's also next to a natural area. There's a wetland to the north of it. And environment staff have the responsibility to consider and issue development permits for those categories should the guidelines be met. So there's a variety of reviews there. I think there's another good example of, it's another greenhouse building. There's another nursery and plant store on West First. I think it's West First and Phillip between Welsh and
It's
West First.
Garden Works, and it took a long time too. Yeah.
And there's form and character guidelines that prevail there. So that would be another example of a case where that might be dealt with at the staff level. And the externalities of other permits aside, if the decision was at the staff level rather than the council level, there is a potential for a 30 to 40% improvement in processing timeline.
So I guess I just don't know what 30 to 40% means, because I'm not, I know what the complaint is. I'm just not sure if, there's a log jam somewhere and that's what this was supposed to fix. But we're focusing on these things where we maybe get, as far as the industrial, maybe an application a year, while there's still things getting sort of stuck in the pipe. So I guess, you're telling us what you think you want us to give you control over to solve this problem. I just don't know where the problem is. We had one presentation by the consultant. He had some stern warnings, I recall, and then we haven't really heard anything since. This is sort of first iteration, and we were asked to move this forward to a hearing, and there's been so many questions tonight, so I just don't think it's very clear. I think we're trying right now through this discussion, but I just think there's a lot to understand and consider. And when you don't really you guys understand the process from start to finish. We only see the part that comes to us, and then when we get a complaint from someone.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor. Can we proceed on to section 4? And
all right. Thank you, Your Worship. On to final part 4, which, as I had discussed at November 3rd meeting, it relates to variance permit delegation. So that's of minor variances when related to subdivision of, and this is mostly related to subdivision of detached residential lots. So through a text amendment to the development procedures bylaw. So we've come back to the development procedures bylaw now. So as a reminder, council first delegated minor variances to staff in 2023, and again in early 2025, further variances related to coach house were delegated to staff. To be sure, council will continue to have the discretion over variances related to these categories shown on screen here, like heritage, protected heritage property, and work without permits amongst the others on the list. So in the last section, I had said we would get on to the topic of minor variances. And so here we are. And so we just want to echo again that minor variances are those that relate to the siting, size, or dimension of buildings or structures.
Any building?
Yes, and buildings or structures, and then as well off-street parking. So we had said we would call upon that as well. So siting, size, and dimension of buildings or structures, as well as off-street parking.
So could I just clarify that difference, if I may, Graham? So in other zones, the size of the building is a direct relationship to density. But in an industrial zone, simply the size of the building doesn't trigger a change in density. Is that fair? That's why it can be considered under this list?
So looks like Dan has his hand up there.
Mr. Milburn?
Sure, just to confirm, the reason why it's in the list is because the Local Government Act actually has a list of the things that can be varied. And so I should say the regulations that can be varied with a minor development variance permit. The first one is the siting, size, and dimension of buildings and structures of a permitted use. That is the only kinds of zoning regulations that can be varied. In addition, off-street parking, signs, and landscaping and screening bylaws. Those are the only types of bylaws that can be varied through a minor development variance permit. All other types of variances would be having to be decided by council or in certain circumstances, Board of Variance.
Is that on residential too?
It's up to council as to what you want to delegate to staff, but the way the bylaw is structured now is it includes all different zones. However, if we can just go back, Graham, to the last slide, that's the description of the types of circumstances that council doesn't believe are minor in nature and would be instead a council decision.
Thanks, Dan. And I'd like to just expand on that a little bit. The word size here, we're not talking about density. It's dimensional size, right? Perhaps the height or the length, not total floor areas, which would be a density matter. We're talking about height. At one point in time, council had to consider the height of coach houses that were above 1 story, and then that was further delegated to staff to be able to allow staff to consider coach houses of the height variance. So just again, this is not a density issue. We're just talking about dimensional size. Okay, so as I had mentioned, minor variances are those relating to siting, size, and dimensions of buildings or structures, as well as off-site parking. And I just want to keep that in mind as we talk about this proposed delegation that relates to variances. So that being related to subdivision. And I also just wanted to put on screen here the consideration guidelines that staff use when considering whether to make a supporting recommendation for variances. You know, reasons, the impact, if there's alternatives, and mitigating measures that can be taken. So again, this proposal, part 4 of this presentation, is a proposal for delegating minor variances when related to subdivision. Here's a good example of that, and I'm going to hopefully explain this so it's easily understood. On screen right now is a picture of a parent lot that is the subject of subdivision, or has in the past been the subject of subdivision. And here is the proposed subdivision layout, which is compliant with the zoning regulations for subdivision. I just want to stress that again. We're not talking about subdivision regulation. We're just talking about the siting size and dimension of the building that happens to be related to subdivision. So to be sure, the delegation relates to just the proposed retained building. Just so happens to be related to subdivision. So as we can see, a small corner of the existing house projects into the setback area. The proposed amendment would allow cases like this to be dealt with at the staff level and would streamline the processing of subdivision cases that are known to be lengthy. So here's a site photo. Just shows that sliver of the building that was the subject of the variance. And to call back to the last section of the presentation, a reasonableness approach would be to deal with this at the staff level. Building variances such as this already can be dealt with at the staff level. It's just that because this one is related to a subdivision, currently it's within within council's discretion to decide upon, but the proposal is that this be dealt with staff. And I just want to call back to something that came up on the November 3rd meeting. There was some concern regarding the change of character of large lots in the district if they were to be heavily subdivided. And this relates to what I said when I started this section of the presentation. This delegated authority is not intended to vary the subdivision regulation. It's just focusing on minor variances, citing size and dimension of buildings and structures, and perhaps off-street parking. So we're not talking about varying subdivision regulation. We're just talking about allowing staff to consider varying building regulation. And so that concludes the 4th and final section. To recap, the staff recommend council delegate to staff consideration of minor variances when associated with subdivision. And I invite some discussion or any questions before passing the mic over to Lisa.
Councilor Murray.
So we're just going back to the siting size or dimension of buildings. So you could vary a setback. So you could go to a 0 lot line.
Conceivably, although the communication guidelines would very unlikely result in the staff.
So you say
support.
kind of not, and Dan says yes. Now I'm really confused.
Your worship, depending on the circumstance, if and let's be clear, we're not asking to change the definition of minor variance. The guidelines that staff apply, those are all consistent and the same. The question was, if we went down to a 0 lot line in an industrial type location, a 0 lot line may make sense in a certain circumstance. In a residential application, typically not. And the reason why a zero lot line, or actually anything less than 4 feet, is quite impactful on the neighbor is there are fire separation regulations between buildings. And as soon as you encroach closer than the 8 feet, so 4 feet on both sides of the property line, you then have to start talking about the openings within the building being limited, as well as non-combustible materials used on the cladding. Additionally, you often experience drainage concerns between the two properties when you start tightening up that setback, and you can have roof leaders and drainage flowing onto a neighbor's property. So we're usually quite careful in evaluating setback variances because they would, in many cases, potentially impact the use and enjoyment of the neighbor and have an impact that is unacceptable. So what we're referring to here are often like minor variances. They really are small. They're small relative to the overall setback, and they don't cause impacts like fire separation, drainage problems on the neighbor, and the like.
I think it would have been really good if you could have provided some examples, like the minimum and then the maximum in all of these sections, just to sort of show what you're talking about. It seems to be, it's not, I just don't know if we had to explain this, if it would be as clear, because there seems to be some confusion even with your understanding and maybe Mr. Budge's understanding, and that's where I'm getting a little bit concerned. Do we have any zero lot line developments? What can you give some examples?
Yeah, we have many zero lot line developments. Often in industrial sites, we'll have a firewall between one property and the next, just a concrete or cinder
But you
block
don't
wall.
have any like examples that you could say, C-SPAN or office building, or you couldn't give. That's what I'm talking about.
Most of our light industrial parks, so the Pemberton light industrial, you'll see the buildings sit often side by side or back to back on their side yard, as well as Lynn Creek. You'll often have industrial development right beside industrial development. So it's
what
quite
about
common.
Is Baden Park zero lot line? What's the setback on that?
It varies, I think, by the height of the structure. So there's different setbacks to different lot lines, and those were all set by council at the time of rezoning for that project.
But you don't know what they are.
Off the top of my head, I don't have the number off the top of my head. I recall that there was a significant debate about the setback to the adjacent single family development to the east, and council set both a height limit as well as a setback limit to try to create an appropriate separation to those neighbors.
And so a project like that was dealt with through rezoning.
Correct.
And so your delegated variance eligibility would be what example? Dykoff coming in and building their structure and you determining that it could sit at the lot line.
Yeah, variances are much more common with existing development where people are coming in and looking to do some expansion or addition. That's where variances typically come up. With new developments, because there's so much scrutiny on the initial design and there's so many conditions with respect to the setbacks and the height and the aesthetics that are set by council through their review process, that we typically never see those kinds of variance requests.
And then your consideration guidelines for a delegated variance eligibility, but if you were delegated the authority, where would the public input come in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we follow the same kind of public notice procedure that non-delegated variances apply. So we do notice to the neighbors and all the different kind of notice that goes along with a typical variance, and then we receive and consider that feedback. Again, if it was something that garnered significant feedback and concern, the permit would typically be either modified and approved. If that modification addressed the concerns being raised, could be refused by staff and then appealed by the applicant to council. Or in circumstances, certain ones, staff can refer it to council as well. So that's the
What are the
process.
what are the requirements to refer to council? Because again, that's a staff delegated decision. So
yeah. In the past, it's typically been where the impact is to public infrastructure or district lands. We've done those kinds of referrals. So there's usually some kind of external factor that might be impacting council's direct authority over land is typically in those circumstances. A more straightforward way is simply for staff to deny it, and then the applicant has a right of appeal to council for council to reconsider that decision.
okay, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else like to ask questions on the entirety of the Dapper project at this time?
Your worship, if I could make a comment.
Mr. Stewart, go ahead.
Yeah. So I just want council to know, I mean, some of these are can be considered major, depending on your perspective, and some could be considered minor from your perspective in terms of the control you've traditionally had with respect to development. I just want you to know that the province is now turning their minds to light industrial and industrial. And they've started a series of considerations and interviews. And I think the intent is to make some changes there too. So I just want you to be, I want to give you a heads up because we know what they've done with housing and what they could do with light industrial and industrial could be just as significant and just as swift. So I'm just being really honest with you because I see this coming in the next year. So
Okay. Noted. I'll double check with the council. Are there any other questions or concerns? And just to remind you of the process, so then we would wrap up the workshop. This item would return back to a regular council meeting where it would then we would re-ask the question on referring it to a public hearing. And then it would be referred to a public hearing and then come back for final readings and adoption. That's the process. Okay.
Well, are we going to be presenting what we've just heard to the public at the public hearing? Is that?
Well, all of the materials have been presented publicly. This is a public meeting.
I just mean the presentation, Mayor Little, not, just how we're going to present the information, because it's certainly garnered a lot of questions from us. And I just don't know if,
It's a fair concern. When we have a public hearing, we typically have a 15-minute presentation from staff to introduce an item. And I think we've all discovered that there's no way you can explain the complexity of this issue in 15 minutes reasonably. And so how do you intend to present it for the public hearings consumption in a way that's fair to the public?
Thank you. Happy to jump in there, Mayor Little. The public hearing is related to bylaw 8763. So that's the amendments to the official community plan. The other amendments related simply to the development procedures bylaw doesn't require and isn't appropriate to have a public hearing for that kind of amendment. It's just a procedures bylaw amendment. So our presentation would be confined to the bylaw amendments to the official community plan.
And that was so not clear when it was brought to council the last time. There were 3 sections.
And that's why staff took great pains to describe it in the earlier slide where we described the 2 bylaws and the 4 different changes and what bylaw affected what change. And maybe Graham, would that be too difficult to return back to that slide? It was near the beginning of your presentation.
But my point is that, that's what's precipitated this meeting. I don't know if it's I don't know if we're clear.
Well, I don't mind saying I definitely have a better understanding of the material, which is to say we certainly benefited from a broader in-depth discussion about it. I don't know that I can definitively say, oh yeah, well that's how staff's going to interpret this way or that way in all circumstances. And as I've said on a number of occasions, I still think there's a challenge with um, the definition of minor and the definition of minor containing the use of the word reasonableness. It's a little bit variable on
Objective.
levels. And so I come to that just simply, as I said in the last meeting, to protect staff from having to make a decision that is potentially could have serious ramifications, even though it may seem minor. It may have significant changes to a neighborhood. The pictures that were displayed do represent something that I think I would consider to be a minor amendment on the siding of the building in your option 4 that you presented. But the industrial siding and size of the building may not actually be that minor a change. So I don't know if I'm still, I think, we have to be ready to move forward. And in part, sometimes the exercise is making sure that staff understand the application of the particular issue. It's not always going to be about whether council fully understands every single application coming forward or understands which way staff would go on it. I see Councillor Forbes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have about 3 or 4 questions.
Okay.
I'm still confused, so I'll go back and read everything I wrote down and look at this again. But the first question is, when are we hoping this is going to come back to council?
Check in with the clerk. Do you have a date or time in mind for when this item would return?
Thank you, through your worship. With the last meeting being December 8th of this year, it's likely that it would be at the first regular meeting in January, but I can confirm that with Mr. Milburn.
Okay. Councillor Forbes?
I think that would be a good idea, just to give us all time to sort of rework through these things. Maybe January would be better, and I know that the 8th, I think, is pretty booked. The next thing is, I'm just wondering, the guidelines or maybe I'll ask it as a question. Are the guidelines sufficient enough that different staff wouldn't have different ideas of reasonableness?
Happy to jump in there and answer that. The guidelines that Graham referenced, they're summarized in the presentation, but they're actually in quite a bit of detail. So if council's interested in the guidelines staff use to assess minor, if you really want to pour into it, it's in Schedule B of the Development Procedures Bylaw that talks about the guidelines staff use. So the question was, how would staff be consistent with the application of those guidelines? And the intent of it is that each staff member who processes the application prepares a recommendation based on all the public feedback, based on their assessment. But ultimately, it rests with the general manager position or the manager of development planning. It doesn't rest with the individual planners to make the final determination of the issuance of the permit or not. So there is some consistency in terms of a senior staff, exempt staff person who is ultimately making that decision. And I can tell you, we typically make decisions based on conventional decisions council's made in the past. A lot of these recommendations are coming forward because we've often heard from council when these minor items come before council. There's this exasperation from council that if only there was a simpler process, could this be dealt with? And that's a big part of the justification for us bringing these forward to you today. But that's how we ensure consistency. Essentially, is having senior staff reviewing the guidelines which are set out in bylaw by council.
So if those senior positions ever changed, you could have a change in what the department considered reasonableness.
Yeah, with delegated authorities. There is essentially that opportunity to have the staff make those decisions. I'll give you another example. Building permits. Council can't issue building permits. Those can only be issued by a building official, and they have to use discretion of what is reasonable and their assessment of the guidelines. The important part is to make sure that the guidelines are clear enough for staff so that consistency can occur. The one little caveat to that is the whole point of a variance is that it's usually to do with some unusual circumstance. It's to do with something that's new, novel, hasn't been seen before. It's new to that property. It's new to that individual. And so, yeah, having some discretion in terms of being able to interpret council's guidelines and apply them is necessary because they're each considered on their own.
Just two quick examples that have come up in the past. We allowed a coach house in a front yard, and that was basically because of the design of the coach house and the landscaping that was at the front yard, so you really didn't even notice it or see it. So that was a variance. And then there was another one where a person wanted to have another parking spot, and they had room to have it if I remember correctly, they had room to already have it on the back, and yet it was being recommended by staff that they create a new parking spot on the front. And I know that went through council, and we ended up asking the applicant if they just wanted to keep the parking spot in the back and expand it maybe a little bit, and that's what they did. So I'm a bit concerned, and this leads me into my next thing, is that I'm a bit concerned about definitions as well. Like where can you get the exact definition of minor? Is there an exact definition in
Yep.
yeah?
We will forward that exact because this is just summary in presentation material. We'll
Yeah.
give you the enabling power in the Local Government Act that says minor, and then it asks for council to set criteria as well as guidelines. And so we'll give you a
Okay.
copy of the criteria and the guidelines that are in the development procedures bylaw. We'll forward that to you tomorrow, all of council.
That would be great. And my last question is, it's already been said by someone else tonight, but I mean, you guys, this is your profession, and you work with this every day, and so you're experts at this. Council is not experts on this. So I'm just wondering, I think it was Councillor Bury who mentioned, is there any way to kind of get a flow chart or something that lays out the process steps for us so that we can get a better handle on just, if we say, oh, it's going to save us 4 weeks here, well, maybe it has a compounding factor past that 4 weeks that really helps speed it up. But we don't know because we don't know what all the steps are. So is there any way to get anything like just a simple flow chart or something that shows the process, the
Absolutely.
steps?
Yep.
That
Yep.
would be
We'll forward that to
terrific.
council as well.
That would be terrific. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Councillor Murray?
We didn't really go into the variances of parking.
In part, it's because they're already delegated, so we're not asking for a change in that
But
circumstance.
we mentioned that so we were just mentioning what we're already doing
That's
on
correct.
top of what we
Yeah.
want to do.
And what I heard from some council members is they're trying to understand the authorities that are already delegated, such as parking, and whether or not what's the criteria used and what's the guidelines that staff use to evaluate those. And that I think was the request from Councillor Forbes. There's a desire by some council members to see the particular guidelines, and they're right from the procedures bylaw. We're happy to share that with council.
So just on the example that Councillor Forbes gave, it was an application where we allowed a coach house in the rear and there was a front driveway. And we were asking them to close the front driveway. Mm-hmm. And council said, we don't really want to do that because we're trying to get cars off the road, or so that seems. And yet now we're telling people to get rid of the front driveway. And I don't recall ever hearing back as to what actually happened.
Yeah, so that was referred to the engineering team to respond with respect to criteria in that circumstance, actually, that was a bylaw requirement to have the driveway access the lowest standard road. So if there was a road and a lane, the intent was to access the lane and to only have typically one access. And the applicant wanted, I think, to preserve two. Can't remember the exact details, but the request back to the staff in that circumstance wasn't related to the development delegated authority. It was actually related to the bylaw standard for where a driveway must access the road based on its standard. And that's set out in I believe it's the streets and parking bylaw. And so that was referred, I believe, to the transportation team to provide a response. And I'm not sure if a response has been provided yet. We can confirm that with our engineering team.
Yeah, I think that would be good because that was like 2 years ago or at the beginning of this term, or maybe, I think was it everybody here? Do you all remember that? Herman, and do you remember that, Herman?
I
You
think
you
think
don't
it was in the first term.
Yeah, there you go. It was in the previous council. So I mean, these things are brought up at these meetings. We ask for things and then they just kind of disappear and never come back until we remember. And so we've remembered. So it'll be interesting to see where that ended up because
I apologize. My memory is a little bit fuzzy too, because it was a separate team that was responsible for responding to council. So we'll make sure we follow up with that team. And if a response hasn't been provided or been provided, I'll get those facts to council.
Yeah, so it's those kinds of things that sort of, make this challenging in the sense that there's these calls being made. And then, often I'm not sure if it's in the context of an entire area or just a single application. Are we going to make variances on parking or setbacks or size based on the isolated lot? Or are we making it based on the entire area and what's going on and what's changing and what's happening? Because things are constantly changing, and yet we seem to be often quite cemented and regulated into a certain position. I mean, we're talking about it right now with short-term rentals and how that we have some properties that can't accommodate the parking. They've been using the parking for years. We've taken money from short-term rentals, even when we had a bylaw against them. And now we're requiring people to put in parking because all of a sudden we're regulating it. And yet we didn't care for all the years that short-term rentals were in existence. We actually received money from the fees that they paid. And now we're asking them for parking. So we're rigid in one way. We want the ability to be able to delegate in another and remove that authority from council. And then we want to be, flexible. It's hard to keep up in regards to how we do all of this because there seems to be, it's not really a level playing field. It's not consistent across the board.
Okay. Councillor Back.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Mayor Little. I just want to thank staff for the presentation tonight. I know I am a little bit more clear on a lot more details of this review. I think council, we've asked a lot of questions and we've also heard a lot of solid answers from staff. So again, I just want to thank staff. We're not going to settle on every detail of this at this table tonight. So I don't want us to get kind of caught up in those details. I think there's still going to be enough time to move ahead and let these improvements start working with more chances for council to ask questions and the public to weigh in as we go along. So just want to end on that kind of note and say that I support the process moving forward.
Thank you. I don't see any other comments from council. I do have a virtual hand from a member of the public. So I'm going to ask that we invite them over as a panelist. Corey Cost, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm not sure if you can see me or.
I can definitely hear you. Oh, and see you. Welcome. You have 3 minutes to address the workshop.
Thank you, Your Worship, and good evening, council members. I just have one comment. I have many of them on my paperwork, but the one I think I'd like to remind council of was the discussion on short-term rentals and parking spots. And there was one situation, and I commented on that, and I felt that was inappropriate to allow a parking spot on the public boulevard. This is not only a bad thing to do, but it's not a safe thing to do. And as I said, periodically, there are lots of kids that walk on the boulevard because there's no sidewalks in our community in many places. So please don't pollute the one place that people can safely walk, especially those coming to and from school. Otherwise, I'm surprised that Back showed up. He gave, I think, regrets at the beginning, and then Pope showed up mysteriously somewhere in the brief bio break of the mayor, but then never appeared on screen. So that's my comments for the evening. There's Councillor Pope, I see now.
Been here all night.
Yes.
I've been here all night.
Yes, but your image did not appear. So it was never broadcast. That is peculiar. And there's some real broadcast quirks and Chickmunk that were hilarious. Oh, well, thanks for an entertaining and informative meeting.
Figure out how Graham did that cool thing with his voice, but
Can we
Councillor
just-
Mack, your hand's still up. Is that another comment?
Just wanted to clarify, I didn't think I was going to be able to attend this workshop initially tonight. So just to respond to Dr. Costa, I had a childcare issue, but I was able to resolve it. So at the last minute I could attend, so that's why I'm here.
Thank you. Councillor Murray?
Can we at one point, like not now because it's not nearly 9:30, but can we at one point hear from Lisa Stallum about like where we are in this process? We've spent a lot of time on things that are minor, but what is minor? And like I'd like to understand where we are with single family and how they do one thing and then it gets sent back and then they do another and it gets sent back and they do another and it gets sent back. That's the big problem. That's the big complaint. So when can we have a meeting or workshop so you can tell us about where those log jams are, what that looks like, how we're going to fix it, instead of the steps to actually make the changes. I think that's probably the issue that I have is I need to understand why we're doing these things to understand if there's a problem or not just being told. I need to understand it myself. So
Just a quick comment from Mr. Stewart.
Yeah, Your Worship, we have a meeting this week to talk about this. We've had a bit of a split over time with the two areas that are in charge of development in single family versus multi-family. And we know that we need to make some changes to make that faster and better and easier. And so we do have a meeting this week to talk about that. And I probably will make some organizational changes to accomplish that.
thank you.
Okay, great.
Move adjournment.
We have completed the business of this evening's meeting, so I'll accept adjournment. Thank you, Councillor Murray. Thank you, staff, for your preparation for this evening's meeting. I do appreciate all the work that went into the slideshows and everything. Wish everybody a fantastic week and good night.
Good night, everyone.